We're now on Daf Tzadi. The ein chayoven aleh mishum pigul nosar v'tomei. So again, according to the logic here of Rabbi Eliezer, with regard to the emurim of Kodshim Kalim, number one, there's no me'ila, and number two, if let's say you had a machshavas pigul about eating these emurim chutz lizmano, or if you leave over the emurim, or if a tummy comes in contact with these emurim, none of these psulim will generate a chiyuv kares. Why? Because according to the logic of Rabbi Eliezer, these emurim before zrikas hadam are not yet kodshe kodshim, and they still retain their status of kodshim kalim, because although they're designated after zrika for all these different psulim and for me'ila, but right now it still maintains the old status of kodshim kalim. However, Rabbi Akiva disagrees, and he holds Malin behem. There is me'ilu. Chayoven alem bishum pigul nosa v'tamei. My love, shouldn't we assume that this machlok is identical with the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish that we had here on Daf Pei Tes Amud Beis? And that is, the question is, before Zrika, what's the status of the emurim of Kodshim Kalim? And the Gemara says, "B'dahadar eilid pligi." The machlokas is where they took the emurim outside of the azara, then they brought it back into the azara, and at the moment of zrikas hadam, they were in the azara. Ubahar pligi, demar sover mifsale biyotze. Rabbi Lezer says that bringing it back into the azara is meaningless, because it already was taken out of the azor and it's possibly midin yotze, even though it's before zrika. Umar Sover, Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that lo mifsal biyotze. Why? Because it still has the status of kodshim kalim before, up until the point of zrika, and it cannot be burnt right now on the mizbeach, so it's not kodshim. That's why Rabbi Akiva says there's no me'ila, and Rabbi Akiva would say, I'm sorry. What I meant to say was that's why Rabbi Loza holds there's no me'ila, but Rabbi Akiva holds that it's designated after Zrika for Haktor al Gabi Mizbech, and therefore it has a status already now. And we anticipate that status of Kodshe Kodshim. Hence, there's me'ila, says Rabbi Akiva, and all the psulim of Pigul Nosar and Tomei apply. So we have now a machlokas tanoim that precedes historically the machlokas amoraim of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Amar Rav Papa says no. The machlokas here between Rabbi Elazar and the Chachamim in this brisa does not relate to the case where he took the emurim out of the azara and then brought it back into the azara, because in that case, kuliyamalo pligi, everybody agrees that since the emurim were in the azara at the moment of zrika, the zrika is now poel, it actually impacts, and since we're going to say that everybody agrees that there was no psul of yotze before the zrika. So if it went out of the azar before the zrika, then everybody agrees that there's no psul of yotze. But v'hacha b'deisnehu evore pligi. Okay. So where were these emurim at the time of zrika? This is going to be the subject, once we determine the case, the mitzius of a machlokas Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar. The case is where the emurim were not inside the azara at the time of zrika. He didn't bring it back into the azara. He took it out of the azara, and then he did the zrika. And now the question is, if that be the case, then everybody should agree it's possibly din yotze. Ubaha pligi. This is intuitive. You already took it out of the azara, and now what are you going to do? You're going to do a zrika. Well, it's outside the Azor. If it's outside the Azor, it's a psul of Yotze. How could Zrika be effective? But now we have to figure out, what does Rabbi Akiva hold? Umar Sover Zrika mo elis liyotze. Whoa. This is a brand new breakthrough of Rabbi Akiva. That Zrika somehow, magically, will have an impact on something that's outside of the Azor. And if the Zrika is poel, even on Imurim outside the Azor, then for all intents and purposes, according to Rabbi Akiva, it's as if the Imurim were inside the Azor. And therefore, the Zrika of the Dam with Kaviyachol, in inverted commas, which with the Imurim inside the Azora, they're not inside the Azora, but it's as if they're inside the Azora, that will generate Me'ila, and that will generate the psul of Tameh and Nosar and Pigel. So Gemara says, wait a minute. This you're quoting in the name of Rav Papa. I don't get it. Rav Papa Rav Papa is the one who says that the machlokas is be'isnu evroi kule almalo pligi. That if it's avroi means beloshon outside, right? Like a brisa is outside the Mishnah. If it's baroi, then according to Rav Papa, everybody agrees that the Zrika has no impact whatsoever on the Imurim that are outside the Azara. The only machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer as to whether or not the Zrika could be effective, changing the nature of the Emurim, which were taken out, is only in a case where after they took out the Emurim, but before they did the Zrika, they took the Emurim back into the Azara. So Gemara now reinterprets Rav Papa's statement. Hani mili gabi shtei lechem. I think we're talking about Chag HaShavuos now, if I'm not mistaken, where there is a mitzvah to bring shtei lechem in the mizbeah, on the mizbeah. The lav gufe de zvicha, right? It's not really part of the animal. We're talking about shtei lechem, and therefore the dam of the zevach of the animal is effective only on zevach, only on the animal, but rather, for the Zrikas Adam to have any impact on the Lechem, that makes no sense. And therefore, according to Rav Papa, everybody would agree that if the Shtei Lechem are outside the Azor at the time of the Zrika can't be effective on the Shtei Lechem. Zrika can only be effective on the parts of the animal. Avale Murim. But in the case that we're dealing with, which supposedly is going to be a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, is the gufei desvichahu. We're talking about part of the animal itself, right? We're talking about the emurim of the animal that have to be burnt on the mizbeach, and now we're going to do a zrikas hadam, and the zrikas hadam is going to have an impact on those parts of limbs of the animal that have to be brought on the mizbeach. But is to be pligi. In such a case, Rav Papa would concede that we have an issue between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva about a case where the emurim, which are part of the animal of the zevach, are outside the azor at the time of the zrika. So certainly, if the shtei lechem is outside of the azor at the time of the zrika, then it would not impact on the shtei lechem. The shtei lechem are apostle midin yotze. Where do we think, and that is the shita of Rabbi Akiva, that the Zrikas Adam is effective as far as even if it's outside the Azor. What's the it that's outside the Azor? It's the Emurim, the limbs of the animal. Therefore, Zrika has an impact on all the limbs of the animal, even if the animal is currently outside the Azor. And that's the sheet of Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbi Akiva holds that it's Chayav Mishum Pigel Nosar and Tameh, and there is Me'ilah. What generates Me'ilah? The answer is the Zrika generates Me'ilah. How can the Zrika possibly be generating the Me'ilah when the Emurim are outside the Azara? The answer is that magically the Zrikas Hadam inside the Azara has an impact on the Emurim outside of the Azara. Now we get to the sugya of Ophos. Now with regard to Ophos, the Mishnah gives preference to a mincha. Now, what are we talking about? How can the Mishnah give preference to mincha? I'm sorry. How could the Mishnah tell me that the Ophos, right? We went down the entire hierarchy. We started with Chatos, and we went to Oshav, and then we went to Shlomim, and then we went down to Bechar, and from Bechar we went down to Maser, and then after Maser we went to the Ophos. And now below the Ophos, on the bottom of the totem pole is the Mincha, because the Mincha doesn't have any Zrikas Adam at all. At least the Ophos have Zrika Mitzi Adam. So the Gemara says, you know what? I'm going to focus your attention on a certain kedusha, a certain element of superiority that the mincha has that the ophos don't have. And therefore, Adarabba, minachos kodmos sheken yeshno betzibur kibiyachid. We have what's called a minchas tzibur. There is no such thing as a chatas ha'of shalat tzibur. So what is the case of a mincha of the tzibur? That's the second day of Pesach, Tetzayin ben Nisan, when they bring the korban omer. The korban omer is a mincha, and it's brought on behalf of the entire tzibur. So that gives all menachos, because we deal with the category, not the specific case. All menachos now have that superior status that they are ba b'tzibur. Again, only one mincha is actually ba b'tzibur, and that's the omer. In the case of Ophos, the pasuk says in Mina Oph Ola Karbano Lashem V'Kriv Min HaTorah O Min Bnei Biona Es Karbano, and when it says me, right, it says Ola Karbano, his carbon, it means B'Loshen Yochid, that a bird offering has to be owned privately; it cannot be owned by the tzibur. So the more answers, and this we've seen over and over again, afilu hachi mine domim adif. That which is subject to zrikas adam still has a greater status, a greater kedusha than that which has no zrikas adam named menachos. So even though I can weigh on two sides of the scale the advantage and superiority of mincha because it's ba b'tzibur, and that doesn't exist in any parallel sense in the oath, but nevertheless the oath has something that the mincha doesn't have, and that's called zrikas adam. Now we get to Minchas Chote. So once we get down to the bottom of the list, and on the ground level is Mincha, now we have to divide up Mincha into different kinds of Minachos. There's something called a Minchas Chote. Now, Minchas Chote is not offered b'nedava, but rather because of Chet. So the Minchas Chote has a special inherent power to be Mechaper, Ritzui, and Kapar. That gives it superiority. So Gemara asks, Adarabba. Minchas nedova kodem shkein to urim shemen ulavona. With regard to a minchas chote, there's no sophisticated luxury items. There's no shemen, there's no lavona. All these beautiful things that we add to enhance the korban are left out. A minchas chote has to be just, austere, if you know what I mean. Just pure mincha, nothing else, no admixture. But if you're talking about another mincha, which is baba nedova, then it requires shemen, it requires lavona. These are beautiful additional add-ons to beautify the mincha. So Gemara says, kapara on one side against shemen and levona on the other side. Kapara beats it out, and the power of a minchas chote is greater than any other mincha that's ba b'nedava. The Gemara asks the following suffix. I'm trying to move at the speed of light. Minchas chote, minchas nedava, eze ben kodemes. Let's take a look at the minchas nedava. As we said before, the minchas nedava has a superiority status. Why? Because it's te'una shemen ulavona. But yet, minchas sota, although it doesn't have the element of chet, but it's a suffix chet. What do I mean by suffix chet? We don't know if she had adultery or she didn't have adultery. So the mincha is there to clarify the chet. Was there a chet or was there not a chet? That gives it a special high status. Tashma, let's learn it from our Mishnah. Mishnah says, minchas chote kodemes leminchas nedava. So let's be medayik. Which mincha takes precedence over another mincha? That's a chote over minchas nedava. Minchas chote u'de kodmel minchas nedava. Ha minchas sota lo. Why didn't the Mishnah tell me a greater chiddush? That even in the case of sota, which is not really a minchas chote, It's not coming for any kapara. It's only coming to test and decide whether or not she is guilty as accused.
Uh-huh.
So you didn't tell me that chiddush. You only told me the chiddush of a minchas chote. Apparently, you hold that a minchas sota is down on the list, and therefore a minchas nedava, which has shemen and levona, should get preference over a minchas sota. So one doesn't like it. The word he doesn't appear. Ella, what does it say? He mechaperes would imply that it's a minchas chote that's brought for the purpose of kapara on a known sin. But instead it says ba'al hachet. Ba'al hachet means it's because of a chet. She violated the sin through what's called kiddush and stira, and therefore we want to bring she has to bring a minchas sota for hanami ba'al hachet, and therefore it gives it an upgraded status of a minchas chota. Toshma, now that we've presented the various possibilities, let's take a look at a brayso. The brayso says, Zu komedes zu, shezu ba min achitim v'zu ba min asiorim. Now, what's unique about minchas sota, and I don't remember other than the Omer if there's another mincha that fits this profile, that you bring it from barley. Barley is always considered lower on the totem pole than wheat. So my love, shouldn't we interpret this brayso as saying that minchas nedava comes before minchas sota? And why is that? Because a minchas chote has to come from chitim, from wheat. By contrast, the minchas sota comes from siorim, from barley. So therefore we see clearly that even a minchas nedava gets precedence over the minchas sota. So don't tell me the minchas sota should get preference because it's bal achet and it comes to clarify blah, blah, blah. Forget about all that. The main thing is whether or not it's made of wheat or made of barley. Look, the Gemara rejects it. Minchas chet, chote le minchas sota. The brayso is talking about a minchas chote, and the minchas chote gets preference over minchas sota. Because the minchas chote is designated for a kapara for a sin. And therefore you can't derive any conclusions about a minchas nedava. That's not the subject of this brayso. So Gemara immediately asks, why are you going into this whole discussion? Well, this one has barley and this one is only wheat, has wheat. Forget about all that. Why not just say straightforward? The minchas chote is ba alachet for a kapara, and therefore gets preference over the minchas sota. And the answer is the ella, my minchas nedava. When the brayso says that we give preference to a minchas nedava over a minchas sota because this one is brought with wheat and this one barley, is tepuk le. Meaning, I don't understand your logic. You're arguing that we're talking about a minchas nedava. Because if we're talking about a minchas chote, then clearly, hands down, we would know for sure that a minchas chote gets preference. So now you're not in the clear. Your interpretation of this brayso also lends itself to an attack, because you're saying we're talking about a minchas chote. Well, if you minchas nedava, if you're talking about a minchas nedava, that's ba bishemen ubilevona, right? With all the fancy luxury items.
Right.
So that itself should give you an answer as to why it takes preference over a minchas sota. Why do you have to go into this whole thing about chita and siora? So somehow this brayso is really difficult no matter how you slice the cake. Ella, says the Gemara, chad mitrei taimi noket. It must be that this brayso is not going through all the different logical reasons why we tip the scale in favor of the mincha as opposed to the mincha sota. But one reasoning is sufficient. So therefore, in the case of a mincha versus a mincha sota, we give one reason, and that is that this is ba michita and this is ba misiora. But in truth, we could have given other reasons. For example, if it's a minchas nedava, it's ba with levona and shem. The Mishnah says chatas of kodemes. Right, you have two types of ofos. I don't know why the Gemara goes backwards here. The Mishnah goes backwards. I don't know. We got to Mincha, and now we're going back up the ladder to the birds. But anyway, we subdivide the birds into two. There's Mincha, there's Olas Ha'of, and there's Chatas Ha'of. So Chatas Ha'of comes first. Now, logically, that makes no sense because a Chatas Ha'of is Ba Alachet. But Olas Ha'of is not Ba Alachet. Minoni Mili. How do you know such a thing? And the Gemara answers, we're going to derive from a pasuk. And what does the pasuk say? Ve'ikriv es asher lachatos rishona. Right? It seems that asher lachatos comes first. That which accompanies the chatos comes first. And here we're talking, I believe, about Yoledis. Let me just make sure I'm okay with this. No. Yoledis is going to come later on. But we're talking in Vayikra Perek Hey about what's called a korban ola v'yorei. That's for someone who denies that he has testimony, or he had become tamei and he went into the mikdash inadvertently, and so forth and so on. So the person has to bring a chatos, a regular chatos, not an oaf. If he cannot afford a regular chatos, an animal is very expensive, then he brings two birds. One is a chatos and one is an ola. And if he's what's called dali dalus, he's penniless, then he brings a minch. So now, with regard to these two birds, in a case of dal, that middle case, then the one for chatos should be offered first. And why is that so? Where do you see that in the pasuk? She'ein talmud lomer lelame shetikar rishona. No, we're not going to use the pasuk kipshuto to tell me that the chatas of comes first. Sharei kvar domar es hasheni yasa ola. We already know that he's bringing a second korban when he is a dal, and in the korban olav he already brings both a chatas of and an olas of. So why did the Torah have to go out of its way in the previous pasuk to mention that the chatas comes first? What's the Torah trying to teach me? We know there are two korbanos, and it's logical that the chatas should come first. The answer is the Torah is really going out of its way, not for the case of the korban olav yored where he brings both a chatos and an ola, but rather for a general rule that applies in straight across the board. That whenever you have two korbanos that come together as a pair, one is an ola and one is a chatos, then bein chatos ha'of li olas of, bein chatos behemo li olas behemo, and any pair in which you have both an ola and a chatos, then the chatos gets preference. V'afilu chatos ha'of li olas behemo. This is a pellet. We always said that zvicha with shchita gets preference over an oaf that doesn't have shchita, it only has malicha. But now we're going to say that if you're comparing a zevach behema, that's a chatos, to an ola of a bird, I'm sorry, start again. If you're talking about a chatos ha'of, and the animal is an olas ha'of, now you would say that the oaf has strikes against it. It's not a zevach, there's no shchita, it's only malika, and not only that, it doesn't have zrikas hadam on the dalid chronos like a korban ola. Well, ola maybe 2 out of 4, whatever it is. No, we're going to give the korban chatos in the case of a chatos ha'of preference over a zevach, a behema of an ola, because the behema of the ola is not coming for chet, whereas the whereas the chatas ha'of is coming for a chet, so the chatas ha'of gets preference over the olas behema, and therefore hilko chatas ha'of li olas ha'of mi ve'es hasheni, and chatas behema li olas behema mi de Rabbi Rachmana. In other words, the simple pshat in the pasuk is that if you have two birds, like in the case of korban olav or in the context of the pasuk, then the chatas comes before the ola, but because of the extra pasuk that's superfluous. When it says Rabbi Rachmano, that extra, those extra words about that's to repeat that there are two korbanos, and we know already from the previous pasuk that two korbanos. That's coming to teach you that a chatas behema will come before an olas behema, because chatas always gives preference over the olah. But a chatas ha'of, even though it's down on the totem pole, it's only an oaf without shchita. Nevertheless, it gets preference over an olas behema, and that's the binyan av that we derive from this pasuk over here. Toshma, we'll try to wrap it up. We have 3 minutes left. Gotta take a breath of air here.
Yeah, sorry. I do.
Toshma, we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Eliezer Omer kol makom shenischalfa chatos. So what happens is that you were supposed to bring a chatos ha'of and nischalfa. Nischalfa means that the one that you designated got lost, and now you're bringing a second string replacement. Is chatos kodemes. Okay, now I think we're going to finally come to the case that I indicated before about yoledes. Because although Rabbi Eliezer says there's a general rule, but there's an exception to that general rule. So as a general rule, if a chatas behema is replaced by an oaf, like for example the korban olah v'yored, if he can't afford the chatas behema, nevertheless in the case of yoledes v'kan, ola kodemes. The ola will take precedence. Wow. So we're here trying to figure out on the bottom of Tzadiyom and Aleph, what exactly is this case of nischalfa chatos, and therefore chatos kodemes. Okay, so now we have the case in contrast, according to Rabbi Eliezer, of yoledes, and they're ola kodemes. And the principle that underlies this is that in the case of the korban olah v'yored, when the chatos is replaced by an oaf, so the Torah says explicitly that the oaf chatos should be brought on the mizbech before the olah. The oaf chatos. Chatos comes before olah. And the reason is because, look, these birds are brought as substitutes, either for the animal chatos in the case of the oaf chatos, or for the olah, it's coming to replace an olah. Oh, but now the contrast is to the case of a yoledes. If she, who's also subject to olah v'yored, cannot afford, then she brings shnei torim or shnei bnei yona, one as an olah, one as a chatos. Now, here, the olah is mentioned first in the pasuk, implying that the olah takes precedence. And the reason for the bird olah taking precedence is because it's substituting for an animal olah, which itself would have preference over an accompanying bird chatos, because the animal is always more prominent. So kol makom shebal achet, chatos kodemes for kan, but in the case of yoledes, the korban has nothing to do with a chet, and therefore olah kodemes, because as we saw in the pasuk, the olah is mentioned before the chatos. Kol makom sheshnayim boim tachas chatos kodemes. If you have two ophos that are brought to replace one chatos, then the of chatos gets preference over the of olav, the olas of. But kan, in the case of a yoledes, where the olas, where the chatos of is not coming for chait. I mean, there's no bird that's substituting for an animal lechatos because there's no chait. Is ola kodemis, so that the bird ola, right, the olas ha'of, which substitutes in the case of the oledes for the behemoth, the zevach, nevertheless the ola is going to come before the ola, before the chatas ha'of, before the chatas ha'of. And certainly, if her animal ola was brought, let's say she's rich, she could afford it, then that would take precedence over a bird chatas. Now, this is against the Brisa. The Brisa said that in a chatas ha'of always gets precedence to an animal that's only an ola. Omar Rava mikra hikdima kosa, but the pasuk in this case gave precedence to the ola, but only in one regard, that it should be read first in the pasuk, but not in terms of the hakrava, the sequence of hakrava. So the second brisa is not providing reasons why the olas ha'of gets preference, for in fact the chatas ha'of is really brought first, based on the first brisa. The second brisa is merely explaining the curious fact that the pasuk mentions the new mother and her bird ola first, before her bird chatas. So therefore it's read first in the pasuk by one who reads the pasuk. Now there are three reasons why the ola deserves to be mentioned first, as we'll soon see. Omar Rava l'mikra ikdima kasuv, Toshma porim kodmim li'elim, v'elim kodmim li'kvasim, and kvasim li'seirim. Here we turn to Amid Beis. Is my lav dechag. The Bryce is referring to the Musafim of Sukkos. And although on Sukkos, the Izim are brought as a chatos, whereas the Purim, the Elim, and the Kvasim are brought as Ola, nevertheless, the Karbanos of Ola take precedence over the Karban Chatos. And therefore, Parim called the Elim, Elim called Kvasim, Kvasim L'Seirim, and all this comes before the Chatos. And that's against everything we've been saying. So the answer is lo l'nedava. The brisa here is not referring to a regular ola, but rather to an olas nedava. And in the case where one or more people brought several species of animals at the same time to be offered as olas nedava, voluntary olos, one is a chatas, one is an ola, the chatas takes precedence, even if it is of an inferior species. So each day of Sukkot, the Musaf consisted of numerous parim, elim, and kvasim, and they were all brought as olos, but one sa'ir was brought as a chatos. These species were also brought as musafim on other moadim, in lesser numbers, presumably since the Brisa mentions the sequence for offering these four species of animals, it is referring to the festival Musafim, which included all the species. So the Gemara says, lo, linadav. So parim kodmim li'elim shekein nisrabu bin nisachim. So parim get preference because they are accompanied by nisachim. V'chein elim l'kvasim, for the same reason that the elim are accompanied by Nisachim, Kvasim L'Seir, Shekein Nisrabu Bi Alya. Right, this is the third reason of the three, because the goats get precedence because they offer even the tail on the Mizbeah. Toshma. Okay, this we'll have to leave for today because that time is has ended, and everything should be well.